Hi, everyone. This is Don Moxley. I'm the Director of Sports Science for STEM Regen. And I'm joined today with Dr. Sten Stray-Gunderson of Be Strong. Is that appropriate to introduce you that way, Sten?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So, where this comes from, Sten and I knew Sten's dad much better than I've known Sten. We've had a couple conversations. But Sten and I ran into each other at the NSCA conference out in Baltimore. And we've had several conversations since, and one of the things that came up was our shared observation that the strength and conditioning field, in my words, I believe is locked in a time zone that's maybe 2 to 3 decades old. We'll talk about that a little bit, but we thought we both have the shared goal of hopefully helping coaches look a little bit over the horizon. Our objective is to, instead of being 30 years behind, let's start to talk about what we can do to be 10 years ahead, or start to look that way. What do you think, Sten?
Yeah, I mean, complete agreement. I think, while there have been a lot of advances in the literature and in the research and gone down these different routes, often the translation into practical application gets lost or misinterpreted, or like you said, is just delayed, and people simply just don't have the time to wait to figure out what is on that next cutting edge, what is over the horizon. And so just really excited to be able to talk to you about that specifically, and ways we can kind of get around that or address that issue, and developing our own evidence and looking at it from both a large statistical standpoint, but also at the individual level and at the individual level of the athlete specifically.
I agree. And I think part of the challenge, what's interesting, I was down in a large university yesterday, talking to some staff there, and I was talking to a sports specific staff, and I was asking questions, performance last year, performance this year, what needs to happen, things like that. And to inform this a little bit more, my daughter, who is also an exercise scientist, but she is now coaching at the University of Pittsburgh, and she and I have these conversations all the time. So it's not. This conversation is not coming from a vacuum, or it's not coming from an ivory tower either.
Exactly.
This is not. This is very hands-on. And I go back to, so just to give you a little bit of my background. I finished up my graduate work back in 1986, so that makes me old. But literally finished up my and now let me back up there just a second. When I first went to Ohio State and started my undergraduate, I had every intention of going home in Eastern Ohio and feeding beef cattle for the rest of my life. It was Yellowstone, Eastern Ohio. That was my lifestyle. We had 1,000 head of cattle. We were farming 5,000 acres of land. I mean, it was a big operation. But I was also a decent high school wrestler, decent enough that I walked on the team at Ohio State, and commenced to getting my ass thrashed on a daily basis. I was the worst guy on the team. Cut too much weight, had too many injuries, and had to find some answers because I'd been in school a couple years, knew I wanted to compete, hadn't really figured out the academic thing yet, but knew I wanted to compete, and all of a sudden started going down this pathway of discovering human physiology, human performance, and fell in love with it, and that's why I do what I do today. So my position is being informed as an athlete, but also as a coach. I went on to coach sports scientists or sports strength and conditioning for several teams. Was a sports scientist with Ohio State Wrestling 15 through 18, and have a tendency to look. I'm never comfortable with where I'm at. I'm always looking for what's next. And I was talking to my daughter today. I don't know if you've ever read the book. It totally blanked on me. We'll come back to this. It just totally blanked on me. Anyway, I'm never comfortable with where I'm always looking for that next thing. I'm looking for that. And you know what?
Yeah.
Back when I was in school, we had a strength coach. We had a guy by the name of Steve Bliss. He was an early strength coach, the first guy ever at Ohio State, came from Nebraska, cut his teeth under Boyd Epley, one of the first college strength coaches. Then at the same time, I had access to a bunch of guys out of Cincinnati Nautilus, not Cincinnati Leverage, Gary Jones, Arthur Jones's son, who had been part of Nautilus and Nautilus Midwest development, which was pretty cool environment to be in. But I also got to go train with a guy by the name of Lou Simmons at Westside Barbell, who was this was before Westside was Westside and those kinds of things. But that's kind of what informs what I do. Lou was thought way ahead of the curve. Gary Jones and that work they were doing at Nautilus Leverage was way ahead of the end. I think that's what kind of set me in place. How did Be Strong come around?
Yeah, and I think to back up, provide a little bit of context for compared to your stories. I was fully engrossed in athletics from a very early age, and I had the privilege of growing up around my dad, Sten Stray-Gunderson, where I was exposed to these high-level elite athletes on a regular basis. And then, to fast forward a lot from there, when I was looking to go into research, one of the things that my dad very much pointed out was, researchers are scientists, and researchers are sort of need to operate in the realm of evidence-based. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is the athletics sort of sets the threshold or sets the horizon that then years later, researchers and scientists are able to sort of look into those in a very systematic and well-controlled way. But that from the athlete standpoint, there's simply not enough time to wait for that to come out. And, I think one thing to sort of frame this discussion is, it was sort of explained to me at an early age is, anything you read in a textbook can be a decade to 60 years old, right? Or even older. And
exactly.
There's a certain appreciation you gain by reading a textbook because you realize that literally every single word, every single sentence in that textbook, there was years or hours of work put into to actually discover a physiological concept or a mechanism that then informs the training. So textbooks are sort of the most antiquated, but also perhaps the most foundational set of information. Next comes meta-analyses and reviews, which is a combination or a sort of systematic funneling of a large body of literature. And then from there, you have manuscripts. And so the reviews and meta-analyses are sort of on the order of 5 to 15 years. Then the manuscripts themselves, or the actual articles, are sort of anywhere from 1 to 5 years old information. Really, where you get on the forefront in terms of the research is when you go to conferences and you figure out, okay, this group is looking into this physiological mechanism, this group is looking into this practical application, and it's sort of in that tier system you sort of get at and you start funneling down, sifting out all the concepts that are sort of relevant. But really at the forefront, at the pinnacle of that is what's going on in the athletics and what's going on in the coaches, in the coaching, in the practitioners, to help set that sort of cascade. So happy to talk about kind of Be Strong in that way, but I think that's an important frame to kind of start this discussion.
I totally agree with you, but and one of the things that I run into, and I think a young strength and conditioning coach or sports scientist, listen, we beat into these kids in our academic profiles is that double-blinded, peer-reviewed kind of is the gold standard, and in my mind, I watch people sit around waiting for that too long.
Right. Gold standards do not always equate to gold medals.
No, that's exactly right. I love that. And literally, if you want that gold medal, if you want that kind of performance, it may not be in a journal. Okay? It may be good science. You may need to use good science to get that, and we can talk about that. But one of the things I want to express to our audience is that we want these discussions to be good science. Don't get me wrong. There's good physiology, and we're going to talk about that with our respective
and
areas.
there's a reason why I'm at an institution, right? And I respect the research highly, and I'm part of that system. as well. So just to add a little caveat in there, it's sort of like putting on the different hats and wearing the hats, and then leveraging those different viewpoints to then facilitate an individual's progression, an individual's optimal performance.
Yeah, you're at an institution, and again, listen, I've been there too. We've done this, published the whole thing. But the point I want to get across is, I was on a call earlier today with a guy that was responsible for coaching 9 medals coming out of Paris.
Yeah.
He's not at an institution.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
He's on his own. He's that tip of the spear kind of stuff. And this is something that I think a lot of times, so 2 disconnects that I see. Number one is that I see too many people sitting around waiting for it to be published, okay,
right,
rather than building their own data sets, okay?
Yes,
yes. And I think a good practitioner, I believe a good strength and conditioning coach collects data and analyzes it well enough that they'll find trends that they can then take to the chair of a department and say, hey, you might want to take a look at this.
Right.
Okay. But this is found in the field, not
right.
This is done by hunting, not by farming.
Yeah, I love it. And actually you're a perfect example of that, right? I mean, your work with heart rate variability and identifying different heart rate variability metrics to actually, all other variables being equal, will actually articulate exactly how well someone will do in a given competition.
We figured out, and you know what?
Spear.
And now, you know what? The academic community can go ham on that. Okay.
Exactly. And they are, by the way.
Yeah.
Because this is actually a really prime example of what we're talking about here is, HRV has always kind of been in the conversation, but it took someone like you to actually practice and use that data in a meaningful way to then cause researchers and scientists to go, oh, hey, there might be something here. Let's dig into this and run through a systematic evaluation of how important this metric is for athletes, from a wide range of athletes.
And then we can go a whole nother level. So we figured out that there was a blinking red check engine light. That's what we figured out.
Yeah, I like that.
The question is, now you go back and say, what's it take to fix it? Okay.
Yeah.
Then we have all the practices that go into that, whether it be floating or training load or any of these other things. This is where the state of the art is right now. I know when I'm out at conferences right now that are not academic conferences. So I spend a lot of time in the biohacking community, and I'm seeing a lot. Listen, I see a lot of bullshit too. Okay.
That's the other thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I see a lot of things where I start asking questions, and again, if you understand study design, you can ask a couple questions of someone, and if they stop talking to you, you may have found something there.
Right.
But if they continue to talk and you continue to work through it, it's good. So the book was Legacy, 15 lessons that we all can learn from leadership by the All Blacks. And again, one of those lessons is when you're at the top of the game, change it. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
Don't stay there. And I think this is an important part. So I think, and again, for our listeners, this is our objective of this conversation that we're starting here. If you're at the top of the game, we hope to bring you some things to think about changing. That's what we're going to talk about today, and with our 2 particular operations here, Be Strong and STEM Regen. So when we're taking a look at this, one of the things, and I talked to you about this when we saw each other at in Baltimore at NSCA in Baltimore. So what STEM Regen is, it's a botanical extract that has been demonstrated clinically to show an increase in stem cell release and production. And now the combination that you and I came to there was, Be Strong, blood flow restriction training, is a mechanical tool for creating a hypoxic environment that yields an increased stem cell production.
Correct.
So one's botanical, one's mechanical. Now,
love it.
This is the thing, and this is the thing that came to me as I've started to do this work. When we train, I think we want to modify one of 3 domains. So we're either trying to build tissue, red, white, bone. We want to see change in tissue. We want to see and improve neuromuscular neurosystem, central nervous system, neuromuscular, motor systems, autonomic regulation. These are all things that we're looking from the benefit of training, or we're looking for a change in enzymatic behavior. Okay, right. We want different enzymes functioning in different ways to improve. Right. I mean, to improve energy production or any number of things. Yeah. But all training, we're trying to affect one of those three things.
Right.
Is there something else that we should include in that?
Yeah, no, just to summarize, so at the tissue level, structural level, at the nervous system, or I guess you could argue the neural humoral system, right? How the nervous system integrates with the hormone system to have certain effects on tissues, as well as systemically within the nervous system. And then, as you pointed out, the enzymatic changes as well. And one thing to kind of unpack here is, I think, the timeline for those different things, right? So if you're building tissue, it takes a bit longer. Typically, we think of changes in structural integrity of the muscle, structural integrity of the bone, of the vessels innervating those, or not innervating, of supplying those tissues. Mm-hmm. Those tend to take the longest. Some of the nervous system changes actually are sort of in between, and then the enzymatic changes are quite rapid. And by the way, the time that it takes to adapt or cause adaptation in these specific systems, it's sort of on the flip side of that, there's a certain deconditioning effect that is on a similar timeline, but about half the time. That's a rough generalization, but it's generally true. And so to leverage those things, I think it's important for practitioners to realize that you need a large block of time to build those tissues, but then those tissues actually become quite resilient to detraining, and so you can leverage other aspects of the other systems during that time where you're maybe just looking to maintain other adaptations. And so it's not like you should be constantly trying to lay down new tissue constantly. Maybe you sort of leverage, you sort of set that base, and then you leverage, okay, can we create some maximal enzymatic changes or maximal central nervous system or neuromuscular changes to actually to optimize performance and use the limited time that we have as practitioners to optimize that.
Spot on.
Right.
We completely align on that. Now let's keep moving this back to the practical applied. Okay.
Sure.
Now, again, I introduced myself as an old guy. I started strength training under the direction of a strength coach in 1980. Okay.
Right.
So this is roughly 10 years after Boyd Epley was playing around with stuff at Nebraska, and that program began to emerge. Consequently, Arthur Jones, roughly in the same time period, had started to develop Nautilus machines and was beginning to look at high-intensity training, things like that. So we have this immediate conflict in training methodology, right? We have what I called the Nebraska versus the Penn State. This was, and everyone wants to know what's best. Well, here's where I think we've gotten to. Mm-hmm. I think we have to look at training completely different because, I bought a device around 2000. I bought a Tendo unit, a string pot that measured bar speed and gave you a wattage feed out, because I was beginning to collect data and look at things. And I'm like, okay, bar speed, vertical-based training.
Velocity-based.
Velocity-based, yeah. Velocity-based training is, we're now starting to think about this. And so I started looking at this, and consequently, I wound up building my own device. I wound up investing. I hired an engineer. I built my own device so that I could get the data out of the machine into my computer, and I could do some analysis. Now, what was ironic was back then with velocity-based, and I think it still is. I have not looked at this literature lately, but there's a filter for power at about 90%. That if you're not moving that bar within 10% of your best, you're probably not contributing to an improvement in power development. So with that, I put a filter on my device. Do a pull. If it's your best, it gives you a beep. So the software is going back, looking at a database of your work. It's looking at your best times, and if it's your best, it gives you a beep. If it's within 10% of your best, it's quiet. Okay.
Yep.
But when it's greater than 10%, when it's not within 90% of your best, it gives you a boop. Okay. And when you get 2 boops in a row, you rack the bar.
Right.
Okay. That I could pull and just have a bad rep,
Right. Exactly.
So it says, hey, that wasn't a good rep, so go ahead and again, motivate you. You pull that next one. But if I pull 2 boops in a row, you're done. What was amazing to me, Sten, is that when I started to use this device, how quickly you would rack the bar. Okay? Yeah. You'd have your training load, you'd be doing your repetition, 2 boops, rack the bar. I'd be racking the bar 40-50% of what I would have done in that lifting routine had I not had a filter on this. But I kept getting gains. My clients kept getting gains.
Right.
And so
gains in what? I don't want to stop you, but gains in what exactly? In what
in
variable?
Absolute strength, the ability to move the bar. So we could move more weight faster.
Right.
Okay. Yep. So, which at the end of the day was our objective for these particular athletic goals. And again, from my standpoint, I'm doing 40% of the work that I would have done without the device, meaning I would have done 65, 60, 50% more work and not gotten any more benefit.
Right.
So it became an issue of economics.
Yes.
I'm getting the same benefit, 40% of the investment. It's moving up linearly, and it got me thinking differently about training. So my training was no longer about what can I do. My training was what do I need to do to elicit a metabolic signal for my body to respond to grow and come back and train again on another day.
Yeah. And I think you brought up so many things that kind of triggered some things in my mind. So I think an important caveat to have here is we're talking specifically about sort of the strength and conditioning side of training, right? So, the sport-specific training that you're doing, you can have a large amount of volume that you're dealing with, and you can have sort of this exhaustive type workout that builds a certain type of resilience, both mental and physical. But we're talking about specifically strength gains and power gains, which, to your point, a lot of the times less is more. And if you are slowing down that rep, that's just becoming junk volume at that point. And so, I would say metabolic or even the mechanical stimulus is still there. But again, if there's not the same intent and the result of that intent being a higher velocity or sustained velocity, then doing more is actually counterproductive. And what it does is it actually eats into your recovery. So then it limits you for the next day and the next training session. So I think, a lot of the times we sort of hone in on a single exercise session, and I just want to encourage practitioners to think on a larger scale, on sort of a larger time scale and within a program, and different things that you're leveraging. The other thing to put out here is there are times where maybe you do want to accumulate a lot of volume to build that base, as we talked about. Maybe that's the best to actually facilitate structural changes in tissue. But again, if you're looking to increase power, to your point, there's only so much you can get, and if you're adding that extra 60%, you're not getting the best bang for your buck.
So let's go. I want to go back and I want to go unpack that just a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
At one point in time, somebody said, "Hey, the guy that goes over and lifts weights either performs better or gets injured less than the person who doesn't." I go back to one of my early lectures at Ohio State, Dr. Robert Bartels. They were doing work with the swim team then, and this was a swim team that made up most of the Olympic team that went to Tokyo in the early 60s. Wow. Okay? And they were going down to the local YMCA lifting weights outside of the observation of their coaching staff. So I remember this lecture very clear. But my point is this, I want to go back to for the practitioner. Now, think about the objective of the workout in the context of development. What is the signal? I think of teaching skills. Okay, if I take an athlete and I exhaust them, and then let's say it's a golfer. Okay, I take a golfer, I take him in a weight room, and I thrash him. Okay, and then their next thing in that day is to go out and practice on the tee. Okay, so if I'm sending this golfer out onto the tee exhausted, I'm making their life much worse. Okay, I'm ruining their golf swing. I've messed up their strength. I've done all these things. So thinking about the outcome is critical.
Yep.
Critical, not just your program. I mean, this is not about your program. This is about the impact of your program on individuals and helping them move. So that, and this concept of having an indicator for the trigger. I'm thinking about the evolution of cardiovascular training that we started to see with the coaching of Chris Carmichael and the evolution of the Lance Armstrong performance. Set the drugs aside, okay? Because at the end of the day, everyone was doing drugs in that peloton, okay?
Right.
And if everyone's on drugs, Lance still wins, because he's got the genetics and he's got the training. But what we learned is that harder isn't better.
Right.
And again, we now know we can use lactate measures. We can use secondary indicators of heart rate. We can use power indicators. I mean, our bikes are giving us power signals now that we can see when that drop off. That's the same as not moving the bar as fast. When I'm out doing my rep, when I'm doing my interval and my power, it's the same. It's not there. Pack it up. You're past your trigger.
Yes. Yeah. And again, coming back to it, going past your trigger just eats into that recovery. And this is actually one of the reasons why people use drugs, right? Is to enhance the recovery. And using drugs allows you to have a little bit more flexibility, and attenuates the decrements in performance from overtraining, right? And so it's sort of a way around trying to think about this in a way to maximize performance. Can you use this sort of Band-Aid to sort of help, or crutch to allow for a little bit more, maybe pushing a little bit further, pushing that edge a little bit higher, in order to facilitate adaptation. And again, to your point, different types of training, whether you're doing sort of long, slow distance, you need to accumulate volume. But when we're talking about getting that tip of the spear as high as we can, it's all about intensity. And going too intense or going intense too frequently ends up hurting your gains, to your point. And that has been well established in sort of the cardiovascular aerobic training literature even, right? So even the literature is reflecting this at this point.
Yeah. So let's move this along. What we've discussed is the fact is that our observation is that the majority of the field, not everybody, but the majority of the field is trapped a decade or two or three behind.
Right.
And there's opportunity there. Okay, there's opportunity to do better. Number one. Number two, as we change our mindset, we can start to look at the output of our programs differently and optimize and add a level of economics to this. How much do I invest versus how much do I get back? And again, listen, I did way too many exercise sessions back in the early 80s where I invested way too much and probably did not, and probably lowered my return.
Right.
Probably.
And actually, this gets into the psychology of the type of person it takes, both from a practitioner and as an athlete. The idea of this, you have to work hard. All right. And that's
Absolutely.
True. There's no substitute for that. But you also need to work smart, and more is not always better. I think that's the biggest thing.
Yes, and I would argue this again.
More is actually worse.
In the early 80s, working harder, there was a lot of us that got better by working harder. Okay, there was a lot of that. I was competing against Dan Gable and the Iowa Hawkeyes, who had legendary work patterns. We definitely had to raise our game. I would argue now, 40 years later, everyone goes hard. Okay.
Yep.
And again, I'm looking at college wrestling. That's my thing.
Right.
But I also listen. We can look
This
at
extends
cycling.
beyond that.
Yeah, and again, you guys having lived out in Park City, you've seen a lot of long track speed skating, one of my favorite sports in the world.
Yep.
But everyone goes hard.
Everyone.
Going harder no longer is a winning strategy.
Right. Yeah. You've maximized that variable, right? You've maximized what it means to work hard. Now we need to think about leveraging tools to make sure that we're actually improving performance. Not all about working hard.
Well, and again, going back to mindset, I'll tell you, we had a 2-time national champ at Ohio State that said this to me one time. He said, so you know what overtraining is? And I said, yeah, we know what overtraining is. He says, I want to train so hard that I get right up to the line of overtraining, but maybe even cross it, but not. That's how hard I want to train.
Yeah.
And I'm like, listen, I get it. I mean, I get where it comes from. I said, the problem is you passed the point of diminishing return hours ago.
Right.
And there's so many other things that you could have done to improve your performance besides going up to that line. So that mindset is, it's still legitimate. It's still out there. And I think our challenge as coaches is helping athletes understand that trigger. Where does the benefit, when do we hit that mark? And if we go over it a little bit, great. What I'm finding when you look at things like cardiovascular training, things like that, you might be better off staying slightly below what you think the trigger is.
Agreed.
And I think when you start to look at strength and power, keeping a couple reps in your pocket is generally a good strategy.
Yeah.
So
and it can be frustrating as an athlete or even a coach where you feel, hey, I can do more. And I think to kind of move this conversation along, we can sort of express that working hard approach in different aspects of our training. And a lot of that working hard actually comes down to recovery. Are you doing the things to take care of yourself following the training session? You can work your ass off for 4 hours straight, and then if you go, like they used to do back in the day after soccer games, the idea was to go to a pub after, and now you're impeding your sleep. So that hard work can manifest in different ways. It doesn't always have to be, hey, we need to go as hard as we possibly can for 5 hours straight. It can be, hey, we're going to take our recovery very seriously. We're going to work hard at our recovery. And so this isn't to give anybody a pass to get around hard work. It's just how we express that hard work, as I think is important. And, this comes to the relationship with the athlete and the practitioner, and establishing that trust between the coach and the athlete. Can the coach rely on the feedback that they're getting from the athlete in also the context of variables that they're tracking? And we can talk about some of those variables that you would look for as a trigger. But I think it's really important to understand your athlete and understand their feedback. If they're sort of masochistic, sort of on the masochistic side of things, right? And they say, hey, I'm feeling good, but you see their power numbers coming down. It's like, nope, let's cut it there. Versus someone who may say, I'm good on that after that rep, but hey, it looks like you have more in the tank. I think dealing with that individual athlete is really important. And so to know your athletes and to develop that trust and confidence in each other is foundational for how these approaches actually work.
Yeah, and I think you have to be prepared as a coach to answer the question that you just talked about. Coach, I've got more.
Right.
And you've got to figure out what the language is that you're communicating with to say to them, you may have more and I understand it, but what I'm saying, for you to invest more in this is not going to get you any more of a return. Let's go put your time somewhere else.
And just as a little sidebar here, it tends, especially the team sports, in my experience, a lot of the team sports, you find athletes who may be on the side of, I'm trying to not do as much as possible. I'm trying to kind of just to elicit that trigger, sort of to look for the minimal effective dose. I feel like, and this is a sort of an opinion piece, is I think more individual type sports selects for people who are willing to sort of push as hard as they possibly can, and that's when the coach needs to step in and say, hey, you've had enough for today, or hey, we need to go a little bit harder. So I think dealing with that from a team sport versus individual based sport is very important.
because there's a conflicting feedback piece. Because what we know we know that when you're very intense and you're creating a lot of lactic acid, and you've got, and your system's going to be pouring cortisol, you're going to get a dopamine response. Okay,
Right.
it's going to feel good. Okay,
Yes.
the pain feels good, and
Yeah.
again, that's where the masochist comes from and so forth. But
Right.
it doesn't make you better.
Correct. Right.
That's what's critical. I think that's
the
what's
key.
so important.
That's the key. And yeah, to your point, often what feels good is not better.
Right.
It kind of comes down to that. And especially when you're talking about power, it's one of those things where a lot of the time less is better. And I think we've harped on this point, but it's an important one.
We've got two good things. Gold standards don't lead to gold medals.
Yeah.
And just because it feel good doesn't make you feel better. Doesn't make you better. Okay, so two good things. Now, so we talked about the three domains that we're looking at training, and this is kind of what we're going to get to today to talk a little bit about is that, and this is what really dawned on me when I really started to bury my head in this space. At the end of the day, when I train physically and I'm looking to modify tissue, it's stem cells. Okay,
Right.
We're looking to trigger stem cell response.
Right.
And I really think that's a period, end of story statement.
Right.
And again, to contribute to this, if you train too much and you have too much cortisol and you have too much inflammation, it's going to limit the stem cell response. There's a sweet spot for that. But we can also promote this stem cell again from a mechanical use of blood flow restriction training. If we're looking for the signal in order to lead to the stem cell response to get the most out of, is there anybody doing 100% BFR work?
From a literature standpoint or from a athletic context
From a practical standpoint. Yeah, is there anybody out there that's
100%
on
no.
that extreme?
No. I would not say that there's a 100% blood flow restriction. And actually, in my estimation, I think incorporating or combining sort of a velocity-based training program with blood flow restriction kind of gets at exactly what we're talking about. You trigger. And again, we're kind of using terms here, but you sort of trigger the mechanical or the neuromuscular responses, but then you put the BFR straps on or B-strong straps on, and you really ramp up the metabolic side of things. But because you're using light weights, because you're not doing as much damage, and because there's not as much cost associated with that metabolic stress as otherwise would be needed to get to that point of that zone of proximal development, you can actually, from a psychological standpoint, you can help your athletes sort of understand that, okay, this work we're going to do with velocity-based training is really maximal and really intense. And then we're going to take a break from that. We're going to table that. And then we're going to take those same muscle groups to approaching failure. We're going to ramp up lactate, all these things that we just talked about, to both from a psychological standpoint, give that athlete that sort of release and give them that cortisol and dopamine sort of arousal state, without actually having to incur the cost of that's normally associated with getting there. And I think that's really what the magic behind BFR and how we can leverage it in our athletes. And this has been shown, this is something in the literature. Myogenic stem cells are triggered by blood flow restriction training. And not only that, but you also have increased capillarization, and so you're allowing the muscle to actually get more nutrients, get more oxygen in the unrestricted state following that exercise. And so, again, to your point, what are some ways that we can leverage our training tools to maximize recovery, cut off the training based on the power output, but then really hammer that athlete with blood flow restriction so that we can actually kind of leverage both sides of the coin.
Well, and what I'm thinking about here, we're talking about our three domains. If I'm doing power work, I'm not in the tissue domain. I'm in the central nervous system domain. Okay.
Exactly.
And the thought that was going through my head right there was, and I listen, if someone came to me and said, if I'm working with a professional athlete, if I'm working with someone who gets paid to perform,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they don't get paid to lift weights. They don't get paid to do anything else. They get paid to perform. And if that athlete hires me to do his program, you know what? It would not be too extreme to say I'm going to do 100% of your strength work, your tissue work,
Right.
BFR'd.
Right.
Then I'm going to take them off, or prior to doing that work, we'll do the central nervous system work. We'll do the plyometric work. We'll do the load work. We'll do the speed work. In order to get that neuromuscular training that we're looking for, the motor systems working, and then come through with the BFR. I listen. That is a radical concept, but it's not out there.
Right, but it's also not unfounded. You know, we've seen this both in practice and in the literature, that this can be leveraged in a way to do exactly what you're saying. And I think maybe I misinterpreted your question originally. You know, there are athletes who, for the entire resistance training and strength conditioning side of things, they are leveraging BFR, but then they're doing their sport as normal, right, with unrestricted. Now you can throw them on for those sport specific activities as well, but you know, you're getting a lot of the tissue breakdown, the sport specific movements, both the neuromuscular and tissue development from your sport. Now can we just add on the BFR for the strength conditioning in that way?
Which is a pretty good concept.
Yeah, I agree.
And so when we look at the modern, not the modern weight room, let's look at the weight room a decade from now. Okay? Is it out of the question that the volume of weight in the weight room is cut in half or maybe a third? Okay? The work is done, instead of having 700 pounds of weight on a rack for squatting and deadlifting for the large athletes, there's 250 to 300. But there's blood flow restriction bands there too.
Right.
Could that be a weight room of the future?
I think so, and I think your point highlights a very important point here, which is it's not exactly lightweight, right? 250, 300 pounds is not light, right? But it's lighter. It's relatively light compared to what the athlete can actually maximally lift. That's a really important distinction to make here, is that, yes, we're talking about lighter weights, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a lot of weight on the bar. And I think to your point, we're at a really cool place in strength conditioning right now, because you know there has been so much work, there has been this well established mechanism for adaptation. Now can we leverage all those principles that have had years go into that research? Can we leverage those principles to actually get away with doing quote unquote less, but still facilitate the adaptations in a way that then, again, coming back, optimizing sport performance. I don't care how much an athlete can actually lift if that has nothing to do with their sport, you know.
Right.
But if they're an Olympic lifter, they need to be doing heavy weights.
Absolutely.
Right? They need to be doing those things.
Yes.
But again, can you top it off with a BFR workout? And can you maximize your endogenous hormone production, your endogenous nervous system responses to, again, facilitate what you're doing in your sport-specific training? I think that is a paradigm shift in how we think about training. You know, a lot of the times we try to see how much an athlete can tolerate, but again, that's great in a sport-specific context. But when we're talking about strength conditioning, this is when you set up athletes to get injured, is when you're overtraining them in a strength conditioning, which is the worst thing you can do for an athlete. And
it is an absolute abject failure.
Exactly.
Okay. Absolute abject failure. You know, and again, so let's look at that weight room of the future, 10 years from now. Mm-hmm. Let's say we still have racks. You know, one of the things I thought was pretty cool about NSCA this year was I believe there was probably 4 or 5 vendors of force plates. Mm-hmm. We're starting to see the measurement of force. There were probably 3 vendors of velocity-based training devices, 3 or 4. Okay, right. And as I think about that weight room, that conditioning room a decade from now, I see an exercise routine where data is collected on every repetition. Okay, whether it's coming from a force plate or a VBS system or something like it, every repetition. And there are filters. This stuff is getting analyzed and looked at. You know, with my wrestling team, we did a lot of work with them, and we basically measured the maximal of every workout they did in key exercises like squats, cleans, bench, things like that. Now, we didn't do bicep curls and shoulder raises and things like that. But then we ran correlations. We said, okay, what strength predicts success? And we took the team and we broke it into essentially 3 groups. Kids who are All-American or better, which is 6th in the country up to Olympic gold medalists in that particular group. Kids who had started for us but never made All-American. And kids who had never started for us. So they're in the room training, doing all the same work. What were the variables that separated those two from a physiological standpoint? Well, what we found is that once an athlete could deadlift 2.25 times their body weight, okay, they moved from group 3 to group 2. And going more didn't move them up to group 1. So there was a minimum strength necessary. And oh, by the way, we did not see that correlation on squats. We did not see, there was an inverse correlation on bench press. Okay.
Interesting.
Which from a culture standpoint, again, I had a coach who wanted to put a thing on the wall, and I said, over my dead body. If you want to do the exercise, I'm fine with that. But we are not going to celebrate something that's our data said it's inversely proportional to the success that we expect from our team.
Right.
We're not celebrating that. So I think this is again thinking 10 years down the road, and I think that's our objective here. I think you and I started off talking about this. We see a field that's 20, 30 years ago. We want to help this field get ahead of the curve and figure out where they're going to be in 10 years. Okay. I think what we've said is that done correctly, there's probably less weight. There's probably tools used to improve triggers and to measure triggers. We use VBS, we use force plates, we use to measure to say, is the performance there? Because we know the central nervous system part of this is pretty clear cut. And we know that we can use tools like blood flow restriction in order to accelerate the triggers of stem cell production.
Right. And, something that just crossed in my mind as you were going through that, very logical and complete agreement. One of the things to realize about the central nervous system is that it also has a limited capacity to both produce and synthesize neurotransmitters. And just like you run out of glycogen in the muscle, just like you run out of creatine in the muscle from exhaustive exercise, you also can run out of or get to low levels of neurotransmitters that then impede your performance and your recovery. And so you can kind of think about it, this model as like a swimming pool, and let's say you have sort of this constant influx of water to keep that swimming pool at a certain level. Well, when you have a very exhaustive, high intensity, prolonged exercise session, that pool comes down, right? But you're only filling that pool at a constant rate. So if you don't allow enough time for that to fill back up, and you just keep hammering that nervous system over and over and over again, you don't allow for that supercompensation to occur from the training, you're just beating your guys down into worse and worse states to where so by the way, this also affects skill acquisition. So if you don't have the neurotransmitters that you need to actually facilitate neuroplasticity and skill acquisition, you're really talk about a snowball effect, right? You're getting to this cycle of overtraining that you then can't get out of, and that pool keeps dropping down. And actually, what ends up happening, if you put someone through a very intensive program for, let's say, a month or 2 months, what you'll end up seeing is you give your athletes a couple weeks of a break, and then they really rebound. So that to me says, okay, maybe there's some fodder to crush your athletes in a certain phase of their program when optimal performance is not the goal. But when we're in a season and we're in a situation where we're trying to peak and that kind of thing, again, coming back to our main principle here, more is not better. And in fact, it's more than counterproductive. It's setting up a vicious cycle where that athlete starts to actually decrease their performance over time.
It's the addiction cycle is what you just described. Okay, when
Right,
it comes down to it, the ability of a nerve to cycle back is what drives addiction.
Yes.
And so this is what we're dealing with. So, okay, you used a term there that's kind of a trigger word for me, and I want to go back and
triggering an adaptation there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm triggering a response. That's for sure. Crushing the athlete.
Right.
Okay. I think you need to resist that at all cost.
Yes.
I have rarely seen a benefit. Again, what are the three things we're looking at? Tissue adaptation, nervous system adaptation, or enzymatic adaptation. Mm-hmm. I have not seen a crushing workout optimize any of those.
Right.
It may optimize the ego of the coach or optimize the ego of the athlete, but I think this is one of our challenges right now. I was watching some video sometime. It was one of the big college sports teams was taught. There was kind of their sizzle video, and they've got a bunch of players coming back from a practice, and they've got buckets on this bus where all the kids are puking into.
Right.
Okay. Regurgitation is not a trigger, is not an indicator of anything positive. No, if you've got kids puking, you blew it.
You blew it.
Okay. Now, if you think for a second, I think we go back on this, and I think there's a challenge. You got to toughen these guys up. You've got to do that. I think the modern coach has to examine this because kids are different. My parents said kids these days. And then I said kids these days. And now my daughter is now coaching and they're saying kids these days. Kids change. Okay. Yep. Environments change. Things change. Kids have other options. Okay. When I was growing up, I grew up in a house that the water froze in the wintertime, and that if we didn't wrestle, we didn't get a hot shower that day. Okay. Right. So I had mixed motivations, right? Yeah. So to go to wrestling practice. But
that's awesome.
And now kids, you crush them and they give you the bird and they go play some video game, and they're getting into flow, they're getting in the zone, they're getting all the positive reinforcement that we only got through sport. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think a coach has got to pay attention to that. Okay. So
agreed.
So as we roll through this, we're now 50 minutes into this. I think we want to start to wrap it up. So STEM Regen is a new concept in supplementation. Mm-hmm. It is a group of botanical extracts that cause an increased release of stem cells. It causes the body to be receptive to training. Mm-hmm. This is a whole new concept in supplementation, and people can learn more about this. We're just throwing it out there. It's one of the things I do, and it's a benefit. I think it's a real benefit. Blood flow restriction training, I believe, is a key element. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that we figured it out. I don't know if you train someone 3 days a week and you come back in 2 days a week, BFR'd, doing significantly lower loads and just getting the training. Maybe that's it. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I do know I see 10 years from now a better form of conditioning and preparation than what we see today, which looks a lot like what I've seen for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. You're not wrong.
Personally.
Yeah. And actually, this brings up a good point of how to leverage, and I think it's an open-ended question. Do you set up a situation where you have a high frequency of that trigger? Are you triggering that 2 or 3 times a day, or are you sort of setting up your program to where you're using 2 or 3 days out of the week to trigger this, and then to trigger this with BFR, and then you're adding in supplementation, you're adding in your sport specific training volume and all that good stuff to then again coming back to it to optimize performance. And BFR, in my estimation, is truly a biohack. It's hacking
Absolutely.
into existing systems to leverage that for your performance. But a key point of that is you need to have the stem cells, and other nutritional aspects to make sure that you're fueling those adaptations. It takes energy to lay down new tissue. It takes energy to stimulate changes in the central nervous system, to produce more enzymes that are associated with whatever stimulus that you're imposing and to facilitate that adaptation. And again, in my estimation, BFR is such a great way to do that because you're able to push that limit to a point where the athlete has nothing left to give, but because the cost of that light intensity work is so low, you do actually have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more freedom to push that envelope a bit. And so that, you kind of get at the ego aspect that we're talking about here, where you're still giving that athlete sort of that punch that they're looking for from a training session without the cost that's normally associated with that.
Yeah, I think you said it. And to close it off here, I think that there's two things. Number one, I was reading a paper the other day that I put into a presentation talking about preparation of stem cells in vitro for injection, and they were looking at what they can do to precondition them, and they were looking at hypoxia, they were looking at calorie restriction, they were looking at heat shock, and then. And I went back to your dad. I had a knee surgery several years ago that I wound up getting a MRSA infection from, and it was very. It's been a challenge for me.
Yeah.
And your dad, I was at a conference down in Florida, and I was talking to your dad. He says, "No, you should 4-limb BFR in the sauna." Mm-hmm. And I'm like, for me, that was just like, okay, my eyes crossed and the whole thing. But now, when you look at it from a stem cell standpoint. Brilliant.
From a multi-system standpoint, that gets at enzymatic changes, like you talked about, heat shock proteins. It gets at some cardiovascular adaptations with blood volume, and it gets at the central nervous system. You're doing just enough to stress the central nervous system without completely depleting those neurotransmitters that we talked about.
I got to tell you, it's hard to do. Okay.
Yeah.
The mindset that it takes to sit in a sauna, BFR'd, is challenging. Okay, it is one of the hardest things I've ever done.
One little caveat here I want to put out there is it's easy to overdo this as well. So I don't recommend throwing someone in there for 20 minutes and having them train in a really hot sauna.
No.
A little bit is good. 5 minutes is enough, or even and especially starting out, 2 minutes in there with blood flow restriction is likely enough. And just like everything, progressive overload applies here, right? So you always want to leave a little bit of room to be able to progress. Even if that athlete can do more, you want to leave a little bit in that tank to be able to leverage.
What's funny about that is that you just found my old athlete trigger. Well, if 2 minutes is fine, I'll do 20.
Exactly. I don't want people going out and sitting in the sauna training for an hour and a half.
That was exactly what my response was. So that's great advice.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, if you're listening to this, whatever we call this podcast, and you have questions, Sten and I want to continue to examine this. We think this is realistic. We stand here at a show. I see the papers, and I get where academics is coming from. I get the role of publish. I get all that. But I also think there's the ability to network among these tip-of-the-spear type people, the hunters, the ones that are out there. So if you have questions, and we'll go get other people. We have tons of connections. We'll get other connections, but that's our objective. I want to look 10 years ahead. I want to be here as a resource for the coach, for the athlete, for the researcher. Where is this going to be in a decade so that you can be there ahead of it? So thanks for taking the time to listen. Sten, thanks for taking the time. Again, we're going to do more of this. This is purely an idea that now we've got, what do we have? We have nearly an hour of time in our idea.
Yeah, awesome. And it just flew by, and I just want to express my appreciation for but for you and your perspectives, because we need more people like this who are looking forward beyond the horizon, to look at the next thing and to try to not just figure out what is best now, but what is to come. And I think more conversations like this will facilitate that.
Yeah, let's try and look over the horizon. Maybe that's what
I just, honestly, just to give the audience kind of a little bit of insight into how this conversation even started is, we just started talking about these things and are like, we got to record this because in reality, this could be the springboard for someone else to have an idea or for some other new development. And so I can't express how important these conversations are, both in private and in public to have, because it really is the fire that brings the whole field forward. And I hope, maybe 30 years down the road, if someone finds this in the archives, they can look back and say, Don was onto something here, and they knew about these benefits way before we're actually practicing them. And so I hope that's the case. And I'm happy to be proven wrong as well, and always have an open mindset. But I think these conversations need to be had, and we could be completely off base here, Don, and I'm happy to be. But
remember, when you're at the top of the game, change something.
Change it.
Yeah, I think that's what you got to go back to. Hey, thanks for listening, and you can find us. We'll have stuff in the notes about how to get a hold of us, and so thanks for your time.
Thank you.